Dr. Vallée was a senior researcher at the DARPA-funded Augmentation Research Center at SRI at the very beginning of the RV program initiated by Dr. Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ back in 1971. His experience spans the entire life of the program and gives him a special position as an observer and commentator on the reality of remote viewing. He also has a long interest in the UFO phenomenon, has been earning a very, very vaulted reputation of being one of the most rigorous and credible researchers in the field. The materials that were recovered that you have now from the Trinity site, are those being tested?
Yes. Now there are two kinds of materials. There is actually a device that was extracted, that was retrieved from inside the craft when it was ready to be shipped out to a secret location, and the object was on the trailer of a army truck, and one of the witnesses sneaked inside. He wanted a proof that this was real, that the experience he had lived through was real, and he wanted to get something, and he got that bracket that we have, which poses a lot of questions, and we're testing it in the lab. There are stories about other materials, 3 different types of other materials that people have seen in connection with that case in August 1945. Now, August 1945 happens to be the capitulation of Japan, after the 2 atom bombs that had been developed within 20 miles of the place where Trinity happened, where the sighting of that craft happened. So we have a lot of information about it. However, I've been looking at retrieved samples for a long time. I've worked with Professor Sturrock, who is a professor of physics at Stanford, who has done analyses of recovered materials before, and I worked with him. So there is a long history of, as you know, of things being recovered at the site. Until recently, there was much we could do with it other than just, chemical analysis, but we couldn't go much beyond that. And now what's changed is that now we have much better instruments to get these things to talk, force them to talk about their composition and how, whether they are common materials or metamaterials or strange materials in other ways. So that's what we're doing, and of course it's really exciting. We're not going to keep that secret. We're going to publish it. Where one of our papers, which is really the first paper on the subject, accepted in a scientific publication, and that took 2 years. But now it's accepted, so we'll be able to talk about it. It's still a little bit premature, but people will see the paper. It's mostly about methodology, because these are not. You have to assume that these are not completely common materials. So there are things you have to look at, and you have to look at it in a particular way. So that will be published. Again, in the next few months.
Now,
so we can talk about all of that.
Well, the part itself, and you've published pictures of it. It's complete, as opposed to the other materials that you have in your possession are fragments or pieces of. But this is a complete object. What is the testing leaning towards right now as far as the type of metal that it is made out of? Is it anything we can relate to that we have here on Earth, or is this something else?
Yes, it's an alloy of aluminum. It's a known alloy, so it's not strange in that sense. what is strange is what was it doing there? And there are two, I have a little argument with my colleagues, and I can tell you what the argument is about. The witness was Mr. Jose Padilla. He was a child at the time, but he was a very bright child, and this was on a property of his family. And so he was very familiar with the property and everything else. He was on his territory. He went inside, pretty gutsy, and wrenched it out of the wall of the UFO. I mean, of this device. My first idea is that probably the army had been there for over a week, cleaning everything, cleaning all the pieces that were around on the landscape, saving that, taking it away, probably to White Sands, and the device could have been there just to wrap an electrical cable, electrical cord, so that they could work at night and with tools and with a light. This was in the middle of nowhere. I mean, this was it crashed. Actually, it did a controlled crash landing. So the object was not broken up. It kept its integrity. It was not a flying saucer. It was an avocado. The witnesses called it an avocado. It was a large oval the size of two trucks. If you took two Ford 150s and you put them one on top of the other, that would be approximately the volume and the weight, by the way, of that thing. The Army said it was a weather balloon, of course. So it was a very strange weather balloon that probably weighed about 5 tons. It was so we have a good description of the inside. My first theory is this is probably a human device, that the Army picked up. They improvised a system to bring electricity inside, and this would have been a good way to wrap a cable, around that thing. It was turning. It was attached to a framework with a pin, so it could turn around, and you could have wrapped an electrical line around that. Of course, there was no electricity on that ranch, but I used to drive a Jeep. A Jeep can generate electricity. Of course, that's what the U.S. Army was using in World War II to bring electricity, everywhere on the battlefield. And so they had the way to bring electrical tools or lights, so they could work around the clock on the inside of that UFO.
The other part about this is your samples that I've seen pictures of, and you have lots of them. But do you have anything when we're talking about these materials that is also as complete as this part from Trinity? Or is everything
no, we
debris?
do not. And actually, we don't need that. For example, if the case we're going to publish, what we have is material, actually metal, that was ejected from an object that has never been identified. We have several sightings of that object, and we have independent witnesses. It's obviously we started with the best documented case we had. But all we need is to be able to test a part of that metal. And now what has changed also is that we have very, very good instruments to do not just the chemical analysis, but to look at the isotopes. You could always fake, a chemical analysis, You can of course melt metals and combine them and claim that you found some strange alloy, but you cannot fake the isotopes. So with the isotopes, we can go to the detail and authenticate actually what kind of material it was. There have been papers published, for example, by Professor Sturak of Stanford, about tests of materials from Argentina and Brazil that were thought to be very strange, but there was very, very little material. So on the trip to Argentina, actually, I recovered enough material from that particular case, a case in Ubatuba in Brazil, to be able to do all the tests we want to do. So the reason it's in Argentina is that it was saved in a museum, in a UFO museum in Argentina, where two different witnesses brought, one witness and one investigator who was not a witness but came in later and recovered material, donated it to that museum. So now we have enough. The first tests had been done on the basis of very small samples that had been saved by APRO, APRO. One of the early UFO groups of Jim and Carol Lorenzen in Arizona, and they had allowed Stanford to borrow a little bit of that material, but there really wasn't a lot of it. So we're redoing the tests.
In the recent intelligence budget for 2022, there's a big provision there for a new version of the UAPTF. That's not what's important. They're going to rename it and they're going to do their thing, and we'll see what happens. But in there are 4 or 5 or 6 provisions, and one of them specifically, Jacques, is about crash retrievals and dealing with materials from a crashed UAP, and that these materials and the crashes must be reported. Now, this has never been like this before, as we know, and the public has always been kept in the dark on this. Do you expect something to actually come from this, where a UAP or a UFO crashes, debris is recovered, and then this is then followed up on and reported before even inside of the government? Nobody knows where these crafts are taken. Nobody knows. They just disappear. What do you make of that?
Well, there is a big difference, I think any scientist would say, between recovering bits of material that you can analyze and so on, or recovering a craft. The object that we know was recovered by the Army in New Mexico in 1945 was an entire craft. It came in from the east. It hit a tower that was a communication tower controlling communication with aircraft for the north zone of White Sands. Technically, the ranch where it landed was part of the extended, it was outside the fence of White Sands, of the base, but it was technically still part of the controlled territory and controlled airspace. So it hits that tower, and then it goes down. It plows a boulevard all the way down the hill, which means it was still under power. It's not broken. There is one panel that has been ejected from the object. And later the kids are going to see those 3 creatures through that panel when of course, they rush down to help. There is no concept of UFOs or flying saucers or anything, but they know that this is wartime, and when something crashes, it's probably the military, and you're supposed to go there and help. Or if you can't help, you go to the next town and you get some help, to rush back to the scene. They see these creatures. The creatures are extraordinary. They are not so much afraid, but they are sort of frozen to the spot. We have a very good description by both of them of what the creatures looked like. And then they decide to go home and report it. And in fact, their father and the state policeman are going to come not immediately the next day, but the day after, so 48 hours later, to the site with the kids. The kids are driving the truck, by the way. Again, these are 7 years old and 9-year-old. Well, a 9-year-old can drive a truck, especially in New Mexico, when there isn't a lot of traffic jams. And but most of the time, of course, they use horses because the horses are going to make the trip faster than the truck. And they, the two adults, the father and the New Mexico policeman, New Mexico officer, go inside the object. By then, there is no trace of the occupants. We should tell people if they want to talk more about this, they should come to Laughlin, the Aquarius Resort, at that conference organized by Paola Harris, November 12 to 14. So we'll be there for 3 days. Paul Hynek will be there. You will be there, Jimmy.
Yes, I will.
Paul Smith will be there from the remote viewing program, and of course the military side of the remote viewing program that Dr. Putoff had instigated with a team that I had the privilege of working with occasionally. There will be, Dr. Lynn Kittai will be there. Jaime Maussan from Mexico will be there, and I look forward to speaking with him because he has some parts of that bracket that have been analyzed in Mexico. So we're eager to compare notes with him to find out if this is, after all, a common object, or if there are some things that it just looks common and it has special property. Cynthia Sue Larson will be there, Karen Gresham-Nickel, of course Paola Harris, and a number of other people. Grant Cameron, I think, will be attending by through a link.
Teleconference,
and
yeah.
There will be a number of other people there.
Now, the reason why I'm asking about this being in the budget, when we're talking about crash retrievals and crashes like Trinity or Roswell or Kecksburg or Needles, California in 2008, there is no paper trail. And now the government is saying, we need a paper trail. We need to know what's going on with the debris and the crash itself. Do you?
They're welcome to join the research. I mean, that's what we've been doing the last 30 years. We've published a lot of it, in more or less. Research magazines and so on. But now we're about to publish the first paper in one of the top aerospace reviews in the world. After a very intense review and critique by a panel of scientists, so the paper has been accepted, reviewed, and expanded. Yes, the government should do this. We have shared our material with people in France, they've helped us. They've helped Professor Sturak, analyze the Ubatuba cases. We will share, and that's what you do in science. You don't hide it in the basement. I mean, you may go to the basement where your machine is to do the first test because you're curious, but then you want your colleagues to check what you've done. I hope that whole thing isn't going to be classified. Now, let's go back in history, because I remember the days of the Condon Committee, the Condon report from the University of Colorado said there is no such thing. Well, maybe, good people see things in the sky, but it's probably nothing. It's probably explainable. The New York Times published an article saying, well, the Air Force has looked at this, and they say there's nothing. There's probably nothing. The Academy of Sciences said there's nothing to this UFO thing, and the subject was dead, for 15 years. That was so. Now the New York Times is saying, hey, look at these images. Those are UFOs, and the Academy of Sciences hasn't said anything yet. But you have the government saying, giving credibility to this and removing the stigma. So that's good. I'm glad I lived long enough to see that. At the time of the Condon report, I resigned from Northwestern University, where I was, in a research position. I had just done my PhD in AI, in artificial intelligence, in 1967. I mean, AI goes way back. It was first developed for a number of applications back in the late 60s and 70s. Now everybody's talking about AI, and it covers a whole variety of different things, some of which are pretty ridiculous and some of which are changing everything in industry and in life. By the way, Dr. Paul Hynek, who is going to be at Laughlin at our conference, is going to talk about artificial intelligence today. So, and we've had occasion, of course, to survey the things that have happened in New Mexico together, and it's really a pleasure to be able to work with the son of Professor Hynek. So, yes, these should be shared. You don't want just one lab, especially not one, dark lab somewhere. To look at this, we should be turned over to science. And that's what we're going to do. That's what we've started to do with our samples. Sharing it with laboratories that are equipped to verify what we find.
Now, you've been at this for such a long time, and the atmosphere in the civilian community and civilian research groups and civilian researchers, and also the government's attitude towards this subject. And you've been right in the middle and riding through this. But here we are in 2021, Jacques, where it appears for the first time that our government is now, and the Pentagon and the military, are our friends, that they are talking about this out in the public. Is it okay for the UFO community to embrace and trust the military and the government's view on ET and contact? Or, is it too much too soon, or is this a good thing?
Okay, so we're going to see how it develops. As I learned a long time ago, there is no such thing as a government. There is even no such thing as the armed forces. There are many agencies involved, legitimately. They have their own turf. They protect their own turf. They have their own tools. Over the Nimitz, the Air Force was flying over the Pacific at the same time. We haven't heard from them.
Right.
We've heard from the Navy pilots. We haven't heard from the Air Force pilots. So there will be, the government needs to organize its own structures to deal with this if they now want to do it, on a larger scale rather than one agency at a time, looking at its own data with its own tools. That's difficult to do in the government. We have a complex government. The intelligence community itself has, last time I counted, at least 15 branches, and there are other things that, are attached to that also, that have their own, their own need to know and their own territories. So it's not going to be that easy. So what has happened is we've gone 2 steps forward. The first step is the stigma has been removed.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a scientist at a university, you can now openly say that you are interested in UFOs. They won't fire you. They won't. They'll promote you if you need to be promoted and so on. But the stigma has been removed, which is great.
What's the second step?
The other thing is that, as you said, they are putting some money behind new studies, which is what I've always hoped what would happen, because we've done things on a small scale. It should be done on a larger scale. There hasn't been a large study since the Air Force closed down Project Blue Book in 1969. But Project Blue Book has been maligned, in the press and in the media, and maybe, for good reason. But there was a lot of information in Project Blue Book that was valid information that we can't forget. So at the same time, we've also taken one step back because, look, if this is real, and it is a threat, it's going to be classified. And if it's going to be classified, 6 months from now, you're not going to know what these guys are working on. Now, I've had the privilege of working occasionally on, classified, the BAS project. As you know, I was involved in building the database for the project, or at least designing the database, and following, that aspect of it, the computer science, AI aspect of this for many years. But, it was and may still be classified, at least in part. Everybody has been talking about the physics papers published that are brilliant, published by that project. Under BAS, under Mr. Bigelow's organization. But this is the information about the database, which is actually a data warehouse composed of a number of articulated databases that's just coming out now. And, it's important information because it's probably the main product, the main deliverable from the project, and nobody has talked about it until recently.
No, can I ask
you? Yes,
you?
there are a lot of good things happening. We're at the beginning of something.
Jacques,
depending on what turn of events, we may or may not know what will be done with the next step.
How I want to ask you about not specifically, but when you put a database like that together, how do you approach it? Is it a database cross-referencing information? Is it a linear timeline of data? Is it chemical analysis? How do you construct a database, and what does it look like?
Well, it has to be all of that because and there are a number of people who are who professionally working with databases in industry and in the military and in research, who want to plunge into that and will put a big database together that will solve the problem. Well, if we were at General Motors or that would be true, because at General Motors, everything. The parts, the dimension, the weight, the composition, and I would have to be a really bad programmer if you're my boss, and I couldn't give you an answer when you want to know about part number, 200-2, and I should be able to tell you, how much it weighs and what it's made of. Not so much with UFOs, because we don't really know. I mean, the purpose of the database is discovery. The only parallel we would have recently would be DNA. Once we discover that there is such a thing as a chemical structure of DNA, now we need to know what it does. We need to know, and there are a lot of things, as we've seen, if you follow the medical literature, that we never expected the database would have to do. So you have to rebuild the database and build side databases all the time. So you cannot have one database. So fortunately, we know how to build a data warehouse or a data lake where you capture the data and you let the data sort of organize itself. I mean, at first, you have to organize it, capturing as much of the reliable information as you can think of, including probably some details that maybe, just side details that will never be useful, but you have to keep them anyway because you don't know what's useful and what's not. If those things are interdimensional, it's a whole different ballgame. It's not like all the parts, in a Cadillac. So it's a different way of thinking. And I would caution people rushing into that kind of thing. So it's actually, I don't know to what extent I can talk about it. I will let, the people who took the project forward talk about it. My contribution was essentially designing a process and a series of structures by which you could expand, so it would be expandable, and the project was going to go through 3 phases. The first phase, which has been done, was the data capture in different languages from different sources, some of which had been published before. So, anybody could have done that from, some of the databases from pilots, for example, that the French have developed in connection with Dr. Richard Haynes from NASA. So those databases are available. We had to restructure them so that there would be compatibility among all the databases in the data lake. And so that's one of the contributions. The other thing that people don't think about is that you cannot recruit a cadre of people today to work on that program and expect them to be operational on day one. In fact, that would be very, very dangerous. You could write a contract with companies that process databases. I mean, Microsoft, is pretty good at that. So you could write a contract with any of those companies. The problem is that they don't know anything about UFOs. And, one of the great things that the BASS project did was to take the time to take people, investigators, retired people from the police or the FBI, and take the time to train them in what is specific about UFOs. UFOs are not cars. They disappear, they appear out of nowhere, they have psychic, aspects, they have physical aspects that we've never seen before in any vehicle. They leave traces that are complex. And so all those things people have to learn. If you take the best PhD in physics from some great university, I don't care, what is done before or what she's done before. They will have to spend time reading the UFO literature, including the things from NICAP and APRO and the reports from Dr. Hynek and all of that, and maybe I hope some of my books along the way, before they can be useful. It's not the case that you're going to hire, a PhD in chemistry and write a contract with her, and she'll be operational the first day. She can be helpful, but she'll have a lot to learn. And that's what the BAS project did. So the way I designed the project, there were two other levels that we didn't have time to implement. So all they have is a naked data, and it's done in such a way that all the hooks are there for the higher levels. But the higher levels, somebody is going to. I know how I would have built them with the appropriate team. And then the third level was the artificial intelligence, because we're going to need to go to AI to process that amount of data and that detail of data. There, I think they've, I'm not breaking any secret. I think that's in the book by Dr. Keller. There are roughly, you're talking about 200,000 cases in English, French, Russian, Portuguese, Spanish, Japanese, you name it, Chinese. And so the first effort was translation and standardization that the UFO community has never been able to do, even though we kept telling them, try to standardize around a number of things, where here we had a standard for all of the data, but every case has a very, very large amount of data. Think of a case like Socorro. You know how big that one case is going to be when it ends up in the computer.
It's going to be huge. And I remember when you and I talked.
Well, it's huge, but it's not huge by the standards of what we do now, with modern computers.
No, but 200,000 cases, and every little detail on that case individually, it amounts to a lot of data. And the only way
you have to design the database so that it can serve a community of anthropologists,
right,
of psychologists,
right,
of child psychologists, of physicists, of doctors. I put a big emphasis on doctors, on medical data and biological data, because I knew that was probably the most important direction to explore. And in fact, that has been developed beyond what is just in the initial database. And but you have to anticipate communities of researchers who have different languages, different ways of, different technical languages, different ways of looking at the data. And the way a physicist looks at a sample is not going to be the same way a biologist looks at a sample, at the same sample. So you have to break through those walls of classification in science. And that's what we try to anticipate in building the database, because ultimately we don't know what is the right question.
Watch more podcast clips now on our YouTube channel. Go to Livewire Podcast Clips and watch more great podcast videos just like this one.